As I got into my teens, girls came into play, of course, you know how that is. And I continued through school. Um, Unfortunately, I suffered an injury to my knee, so my baseball career is out the window. I couldn't become a baseball player. At that time, they had no laser surgeries or anything like that, so you couldn't get reconstructed like a $6 million man anymore. Uh, Now it's a different story, you know. But I had music to fall upon. And I continued playing. Again, I was still playing with Alberto Santiago. I ended up with Larry Harlow's group um, in the late 70s, early 80s. Um, then in the mid 80s, I ended up with, I'm just going to backtrack here a little bit. Just before I left Alberto's group, actually, after I left Alberto's group, I went to Miami. Lived in Miami for a while, for about 2 years. I worked with some bands out there, but it wasn't until I came back was when I ended up with Hector Lavoe. I was with Hector Lavoe and Bobby Rodriguez de la Compañía, you know, dangling both gigs, you know, trying to manage those two gigs. And I was playing bongos. The Hector Lavoe gig is probably one of the most prominent gigs I had in the 80s because it gave me a sense of, well, it actually opened up the door for me to be better known within the business, within the musicians. And they started finding out who I was, really who I was, you know, how I was recording, you know, I was recording with so many different people. I'm going to back up just a bit before that because I did do a recording with Johnny Ortiz y su Taibori. Tito Nieves recorded that record with me back in 1977. Came out in 77. We recorded in 74. I'm sorry, 76. I was 15 years old. In 1976, we recorded for Fania Records, and it was called Taibori. Johnny Ortiz is a mainstream at this time. At this point in time, he's a mainstream composer, and composed such hits as Catalina La O and A Versus Campo was Pedro Flores, but he actually did a lot of compositions for Barreto, for Picon de Rodriguez, for you name it, the man was there, and he was doing a lot of compositions for Fania at the time. He put a group together, and I was the timbalero of that group, and I managed to record with him. It was one of probably my most exciting times of the 70s for me. And the record came out in 77. I was about 16 years old. Actually, I was 16 years old when it came out. And from that point on, I was generating the work. I was already playing, and I was in the mainstream, but I was starting to get a name as a studio musician now, because at the time I was already reading music, or actually reading rhythm for percussion. So getting back to when I left to Miami, I went out to Miami, was there for a couple of years. I played with some local groups, and I also played with Willie Chirino at one point, Hansel and Raul in Miami. Came back to New York, ended up with Bobby Rodriguez de la Compañía. Then I went with Hector Lavoe. Hector Lavoe, again, was one of my best times. That was one of the most prominent gigs that I had in the 80s, because again, it brought me into another level in the musicians genre or category, so to speak. At that point, they started knowing who I was and how I played, and the calls were coming in, you know, call Chino for this, call Chino for that. But I really wanted to play timbales. That's my main instrument. That's what I wanted to play, and that opportunity opened up with Ray Barreto in late 87, just before Hector Lavoe went to Puerto Rico and did what he did out there. I went to Ray Barreto's band. I was in Ray Barreto's band for probably about maybe 2 or 3 years, and that became one of the best gigs I ever had, besides Hector's gigs, because of the amount of education that I had as far as being next to Ray Barreto. And the respect and admiration that I had for his group. Not to mention the prior timbaleros that went through that group, and for me to be sitting in that seat, I was just honored. You had guys like Jimmy Delgado, timbalero, Oreste Vilato, Little Ray Romero. I mean, you name them, and they were there. And for me to be one of the guys that came in and took part of that group was just enormous. So I felt honored to be there and work with Ray. At the same time, I was still, gigging with other groups when Ray didn't gig, and I was his timbalero, exclusive, so he had exclusivity with anything I did. If something came up, and Ray had a gig, I would do Ray's gig. But at the same time, I was already starting to get a name in the studio field, and I was already recording different things. I recorded Ray's record. By this time, I think, if I'm not mistaken, CDs were already starting to come out. Because when I started recording, we still had 8 tracks, cassettes, and vinyl. CDs were not around yet. But by this time, CDs were already in the market, if I'm not mistaken, about that time that Ray recorded. And that I recorded with Ray, actually, with Ray Barretto. And then I got called for other gigs. RMM was already starting to take flight in the late 80s, 88, 89. RMM Records was established, and they started coming out with new artists such as Chino Nunez, such as Rey Sepulveda, Johnny Rivera, and so forth and so on. These individuals were major hits and major players here in New York with the what we would call la salsa monga here in New York, and it was a good time also because it put salsa back on the scene. At the time in the 80s, at one point, merengue took salsa and kind of did a slam dunk on salsa because it just became a popular dance. It was easy to dance to. The people would go to merengue clubs more than the salsa clubs, and the club scene was already at a point where merengue was just taking over. But then the salsa monga, quote unquote, came out, and that brought back, that's when Eddie Santiago came around, again the guys from RMM, and I recorded with a gentleman who I don't want to say is salsa monga, because I honestly I never considered his music salsa monga. A gentleman that's well known in the industry, probably one of the best singers that I've ever heard in my life. And no pun intended to none of the guys that I played with, because I played with everybody, including Hector Lavoe, Cheo Feliciano, Imai Miranda, Imai Rivera, Mon Rivera, you name them, I've been there. I've done the gig. But this gentleman was one of the most influential young singers that came about, and his name is Mark Anthony. I recorded Mark Anthony's CD in 1992, approximately 92, 90. I want to say 92, and it's his first CD, Otra Nota. And it wasn't to my amazement, because I knew he was going to be a star from day one when I heard him, and that was set the tone for the 90s. Everybody had to sound like him, everybody had to do some music like him, and that's where you got that feel for that kind of music. No pun intended to nobody, but in the 70s and 80s, when Hector Lavoe, when Imai Miranda, Cheo Feliciano, all these artists, I could have played in those bands, or actually I played in those bands, and I performed with each one of those singers, and nobody sounded the same. Everybody sounded different. Everybody had their own chemistry, their own way of portraying the music, their own way of being an artist. But it got into that point right after Mark Anthony's CD. Mark Anthony's Mark Anthony, and such singers, young singers that came out after Mark Anthony, they wanted to be like Mark. And that's where I think everything took a turn, for possibly the better, maybe it was the worst. We don't know. We never know. But it was a booming time in the 90s when salsa came back. The club scene was happening again, and again, I was playing with a lot of people during that time. recording with a lot of different artists. Isidro Infante called me for a lot of productions. Sergio George called me to record with him in various productions. To date, I think I'm on about 200 plus CDs that I've recorded, if I'm not mistaken, maybe more. And that took me through the whole 90s thing, and then of course the 2000 came along. And in 2000 a group came around. Actually, I've known Oscar Hernandez for a very long time, and Oscar Hernandez approached me and he says, listen, we're going to do a recording, and I need you to come down. He gave me the date, and I said, okay, no problem.